Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all having a nice rainy Friday afternoon. Real quick, just before we get going here, we do have a trustee in attendance at this program. So if you have any questions or would like to talk about library matters, she will be available after the program. And without too much further ado, I guess I'm gonna turn it over to Josh Dempster. He's from the Cancer Data Science team at the Broad Institute, and he's going to talk about why we haven't cured cancer. So go ahead, Josh, whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks, Danny, for that introduction. So obviously, this is a question I think that is of broad interest, and particularly since many of us are actually going to get cancer, and virtually all of us will know and love someone who does. And I suspect for most of us, this has already happened. And about at the present day, about a third of cancers in the United States with advanced medical care will still ultimately kill the patient. So what I want to do today was offer sort of a scientific perspective on why that's true. I'm not an oncologist. I can talk a little bit about sort of the science of this disease and why biologically it's such a hard problem to solve. The solutions that have been come up with. I'm only going to talk about actual currently extant cancer treatments, but I am going to talk a bit about them and why they work, when they work. I won't be talking about leeches and bloodletting and purging and whatever from medieval times, just stuff that you might encounter as a patient. And then I am going to end on a somewhat optimistic note that despite the challenges of this disease and despite a lot of false starts, there is reason for hoping that at least a much higher proportion of patients will ultimately be cured of their disease. So a couple disclaimers right before I start. I'm not an MD, I'm not a DO. I am a PhD, and my PhD is not even in biology, it's in physics, so totally unrelated. So obviously I will not be offering anyone any medical advice, and could not if I wanted to. And then also I'm here today just sort of as a sort of free citizen, free agent. I'm not representing the Broad Institute. The opinions in this talk are entirely my own, and aren't part of the Cancer Dependency Map or any of that. And I won't be showing any of the work that we do today. I also wanted to say that if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat and Danny will relay them to me. I can't see anything. Oh, actually, I can see something if you put it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask me at any time. So why haven't we cured cancer yet? It's certainly not for lack of trying. So there is a national institute called the National Cancer Institute devoted specifically to cancer research, and that alone has a budget of about $5 billion. And that is actually a sort of I wouldn't say a drop in the bucket, but a very small fraction of the total money that's being allocated to cancer research and has been now for a long time. So there are many other government agencies like the NIH and so on. And then there's pharmaceutical companies spend enormous amounts and actually ever growing amounts trying to develop cancer drugs. Since the FDA made a change that made it much easier to get longer patents on cancer medications. And then, of course, there are individual cancer charities that we've all encountered. And this is just in the United States. So certainly there's a tremendous amount of money and a lot of very bright and dedicated people that have been working on this problem for a long time. And all that effort has, in fact, produced some results. So, for example, if you are diagnosed with distant metastatic breast cancer, meaning it's metastasized not just to like the lymph nodes in the immediate area, but to other parts of the body, your odds of surviving 5 years in the early 90s were 18%. In the aughts, they became 36%. And this is broadly true across many different types of cancer. You can see that, from the 70s, 5-year survival has increased for almost every cancer type. Some of that is because of earlier detection, but it can't explain all of the effect. A lot of it is better treatment. And so if we take, for example, a really bad disease, pancreatic cancer, which killed Alex Trebek recently, this figure is actually out of date. I think now the 5-year survival is in double digits. And then sort of the big headline success story of cancer treatment over the last few decades is child leukemia, which is usually cured. On this chart, you can see the percent of children that survive at least 5 years from diagnosis. with acute with ALL, lymphoblastic leukemia, and it was a really terrifying disease that often killed kids within days of diagnosis. It moves so quickly, and you can see how many children now are surviving with the disease 5 years, at which point you're probably cured. So that's all great. There are some less good results as well, unfortunately. So a lot of cancer treatment now, still, if you go into a clinic, there's a high chance that what you're going to be offered is chemotherapy, and that's going to be basically the only option you have: surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. And traditional chemotherapy is quite toxic. And there's now enough cancer survivors walking around to have been able to study this effect, and it causes premature aging in the body, in addition to all the sort of well-known horrible side effects that it has at the time of treatment. And it is not usually going to cure the cancer. So leukemias frequently can be cured by chemotherapy. Lymphomas often can be cured by chemotherapy. Most solid metastatic tumors will ultimately not be cured by chemotherapy. We can buy time, but can't ultimately eliminate the disease. And actually, because it's highly toxic, it can create cancers of its own in survivors. This isn't that common, and it's not a reason not to undergo chemotherapy, but it is a reason to look for other solutions. And so the ultimate story here is that metastatic cancer will usually kill the patient. We buy time, but not cures. So why is that, given this enormous effort? There's two basic reasons. The first reason is a really large number. It's 1 trillion. And I'll actually pause here for just a few seconds if anyone wants to unmute or jump in the chat and offer a guess as to what this number represents. A quick hint, it's not a dollar amount. Going once, going twice. It's the number of cancer cells that are typically in a patient at the time of diagnosis. So this is a game where scoring 999 billion is not enough. You have to get all those cancer cells. A treatment that only kills 99.99999% of cancer cells will still leave millions of cells behind to grow into new tumors. So this is reason one why it's so hard to effectively cure a patient of cancer. The second reason interacts with the first reason. And the second reason is that a cancer cell is just a human cell. It's a human cell that's been transformed in some ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about these transformations and what they do. Some knobs have been turned up to cause it to grow more. Some knobs related to its self-regulation and preventing it from outgrowing have been turned down. But ultimately, it's just a human cell. And so now we come to this problem that actually it's quite easy to kill a cancer cell. So the XKCD often has great scientific comics, and this is a good one illustrating this fundamental fact. A handgun will kill cancer cells. So will a bucket of bleach or any number of other things. The challenge is not killing cancer cells. It's only killing cancer cells and leaving the rest of you alive. So an example of this problem, there's a lot of, you can get these sort of originally interesting scientific hypotheses that become discredited and develop kind of this half-life floating out there. And one common example of this for cancer is amygdalin. And if you ever run into a conspiracy theory about how there's a cure for cancer and it's just been suppressed by evil pharmaceuticals or whatever, if they ever come up with the actual instance of what they think is supposed to be the cure, this is one of the things that might come up. It seems very nice because it's a natural compound. It's found in fruit. How bad can it be? And there was this claim from some doctors in Russia in the 19th century that they had helped a patient. They had achieved a remission by treating with it. And so that sparked some interest. And in the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of animal studies in the US to try and use it to treat cancer. Unfortunately, although it seems very benign because it's sort of natural, it actually metabolizes in the human body to hydrogen cyanide, and that's sort of the active result of this compound. And yes, hydrogen cyanide, like bleach or handguns, will kill cancer, but it also will kill your liver, and in fact will kill your liver long before it's done with the cancer cells. So there is no dose at which this works. But that's not true for all poisons. So the very first chemotherapy was a mustard gas derivative. It arose because there was this observation that people who had survived mustard gas attacks, there was lots of horrible stuff that happened. One of the sort of medium or longer term effects was that they wound up having much lower white blood cell counts. Leukemia, the cancer of the blood, the word literally means, white blood, is a disease in which you have one of your white blood cell types starts growing out of control. And so the thought was you could use a mustard gas variant and you could knock them back down. And it actually did work sort of temporarily. Patients quickly evolved resistance and the remission did not last long. But it was the very first thing that you could do for someone who had a cancer that you couldn't surgically operate on that actually did something. And so this really changed people's thinking. It was a fairly dramatic result. So what's the difference between mustard gas and amygdalin? There's a very important concept in cancer drugs, and that's the concept of the therapeutic window. So you need some gap between the dose that will kill a normal cell and the dose that will kill a cancer cell. You got to be able to treat with a much lower dose and get a successful treatment of cancer where you kill most cancer cells and still leave most normal cells alive. And so because the cancer cell is just a human cell, obviously it's hard to find compounds that have this kind of therapeutic window. So chemotherapy took off sort of in the early 60s, and it was not initially widely embraced. So there was an honest debate, and it was not, a crazy debate to have about whether it was even ethical to treat children, especially with chemotherapy. There was this prevailing notion that, you're not buying much time, you're injecting them with poison, literal poison, and so let the poor things die in peace was a prevailing thought. Again, not crazy at the time, but we're very lucky that idea did not win out. Although a lot of the chemotherapists, their careers kind of suffered initially for this, and they were actually in some cases forced out of their positions for prescribing and practicing chemotherapy. They were ultimately incredibly vindicated. So here's what's called the survival curve, and this is also a very important cancer concept. And the idea is you start with your whole population of patients that are diagnosed at year 0. And then you look at what fraction of them are still alive at a given number of years from diagnosis. And so before chemotherapy, or roughly at the very dawn of chemotherapy in the early 60s, this is what we're looking at, is this black curve. So you can see hardly any children ultimately survive their disease. I should say that this is acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common leukemia in children. And then chemotherapy takes off. Over here, you can see in the starting in the late 60s and then in the 70s, there's clinical acceptance of chemotherapy, and the practice starts to become widespread as people actually start achieving cures. And the way these cures are achieved were basically by stacking different chemotherapeutic compounds on top of each other until sort of by brute force you discovered the combinations that would cure children. And if you're diagnosed today with acute lymphoblastic leukemia as a child, your chances of surviving the disease are over 90%. So you are very likely to get a cure. So I do want to say, because chemotherapy, people in sort of my particular field, it's not super highly thought of. It wasn't created out of any kind of scientific work. Or sort of very limited scientific work. It was sort of a very brute force solution, just trying things and finding things that worked. But you have to look at these numbers. This represents thousands of children that get to live. So it's a really extraordinary accomplishment nonetheless. And so when I beat on chemotherapy a little bit more later, it is worth remembering this. Why does chemotherapy work, and radiation too? I'll lump that in with this. So for some drugs, it's actually still not fully understood how they work. And that kind of gives you an idea actually of how empirical and sort of brute force this approach was. But the common method is basically all around DNA disruption. So alkylating agents like cisplatin, a famous, very unpleasant chemotherapy drug, and then radiation as well, work by disrupting existing DNA. And this gives you a therapeutic window with cancer cells because both because the cancer cells are often less good at repairing their DNA. They often struggle with this compared to normal cells, and also because they're dividing so often, and so their DNA is more vulnerable. And for a similar reason, they have to constantly produce new DNA, and that means that they require a whole bunch of metabolites. Famously, they require folate, a lot of folate. So you may, if you're pregnant, it's very important to take supplemental folate to support the fetus because it's, producing a ton of new cells. So myeloid cancer also very dependent on folate. So if you block folate, you can actually kill cancer cells. And then finally, once you've duplicated DNA when you're making a new cell, the cancer also has to organize that new DNA into chromosomes. And there is classes of chemotherapy drugs that interfere with doing that. So you can see sort of all these methods converge on attacking DNA. But unfortunately, even though cancer is very dependent on producing and organizing new DNA, your other cells also need to do this to some extent as well. And so this produces a lot of the sort of terrible side effects that are associated with traditional chemotherapy. It's a lot of cells that often duplicate naturally in the body are highly affected, bone marrow being probably the most important one. That's what really limits the dose you can give someone of chemotherapy. And the side effects are no joke. Even if they're survivable, really a lot of the suffering that's associated with cancer as a disease is associated with the treatments you have to undergo. And ultimately, in most cases, they buy you time, and it's worthwhile time, but they don't generally lead to a cure. So that leads to the question, is there a better way? Can we do something that's less toxic? And the analogy that's very useful here is to think about the history of bacterial infections and other kinds of infection, and think about the approaches people used to have to use to treat these. So the mainstay treatment for chronic bacterial infections for a very long time, right? Here's a famous sketch illustrating that called The Martyrdom of Mercury. This is people with syphilis being treated with mercury. And people by the 18th century knew that mercury was pretty poisonous. And they knew that they were poisoning themselves, but they really didn't have a better choice. And in fact, there might have been some formulations of mercury that genuinely were more toxic to the bacterium or the parasite you're trying to get rid of than they were to the human. So there is a sort of therapeutic window there. But was pretty bad. And then along came penicillin, and then suddenly, you didn't undergo any of this. There was no question of ever being treated with mercury for an infectious agent ever again, because penicillin would just wipe everything out, and had, I'm sure it has side effects, but they were nothing compared to what had come before. So can we do this for cancer? Can we come up with a penicillin for cancer? Well, how does penicillin work? Penicillin works because it's a molecule that binds very tightly to a very important protein for bacteria, and it's an enzyme that they rely on to make to process chemicals that they need to survive. And that protein only exists in bacteria. Doesn't exist at all in humans. It probably exists in some parasites and so on, but doesn't exist at all in human cells, and therefore, penicillin very precisely kills off the bacteria and spares normal human cells. The problem with doing this for cancer, again, always remember a cancer cell is a human cell. And so obviously there is no such thing as a protein that only exists in cancer. But there are proteins that have been changed in cancer. So they've been mutated, or perhaps they're way overexpressed, meaning there's way more of that protein in the cancer cell than there is in normal cells. And so maybe if you target proteins in this class, you can create a drug that's highly effective at killing cancer cells and spares human cells. So so maybe there are these weaknesses that you can go after, and you can have a kind of penicillin for cancer. So there are a couple early examples of this. I want to focus on this one because it's a good example of the kind of drug discovery I think that we aspire to in the field. So there's a form of leukemia called chronic myeloid leukemia. And it was discovered just through microscopy that in this leukemia, you always have this weird sort of change to chromosomes. Chromosomes are the part of the cell that stores our DNA, and we have 22. And if you switch in this leukemia, they'd switched two arms. There's like a piece that was lopped off of chromosome 22 and a piece that was lopped off of chromosome 29, and they were swapped. So this is a major change to the whole DNA arrangement. Many genes are moved around. But it actually turned out that the relevant part, the thing that this actually accomplishes that's necessary for cancer, is that it actually just jams two genes together, one that was on chromosome 22 and one that was on chromosome 9, named BCR and ABL, and it jams them together. And so that logically leads to this thought, well, maybe if you target ABL, one half of these pair of genes, it just turned out to be an easier gene to target, then maybe you can halt the progression of this disease. And this was seen as kind of fuzzy thinking. So the backlash to this was not as bad as the backlash to the chemotherapists, but it was seen as kind of, pretty, maybe a little woo, this idea, because at this point, chemotherapy was everything, right? And there was this idea that there was the sense of the field that the way to cure cancer was to just sort of saturate bomb it with these brute force poisons. So it was hard to get this off the ground. But eventually, I believe it was Genentech that made this drug, and oh boy, did it work. So the resulting drug is called Gleevec, still very much in use today, will probably be in use for a very long time, because it puts patients with chronic myeloid leukemia in indefinite remission. So not necessarily curative, but functionally pretty close to a magic bullet cure. The way it works is it's a small molecule that enters the cell, and then it binds very tightly into this little pocket in ABL. You can see that here's the sort of mutant combination of the BCR and ABL proteins. This is what they would not what they actually look like, but sort of the outline of what they would look like. And the drug fits in that pocket and it shuts off ABL. And therefore it shuts off the leukemia. And just to give a sense of how dramatically this changed treatment in the year 2000. So before the year 2000, this is, by the way, this is the chief of, or a former chief of, was the head of leukemia oncology at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Before the year 2000, when we saw patients with chronic myeloid leukemia, we told them that they had a very bad disease, that their course was fatal, their prognosis was poor with a median survival of 3 to 6 years. Today, when I see a patient, I tell them that the disease has an excellent prognosis, that they will usually live their functional lifespan, provided that they take an oral medication every day. That oral medication is Gleevec, by the way. And it's not like taking chemotherapy every day. Side effects are low. It's very tolerable. It's just a pill that you have to take every day, and then you get to actually live your life. So that's awesome. Can we do that more than just once? Well, what's the basic approach that kind of led to this drug? So the idea is you find a gene that's mutated in cancer. And then there are many genes that are mutated in cancer just by chance. These are called passenger mutations. And there are other genes that are mutated to actually turn them off to help the cancer. So you have to actually prove that this gene is necessary. This mutated gene is actually important for the cancer survival in some way. And just sort of incidentally, so you know my background, this is kind of the part of the problem that I work on is proving that the genes are necessary for cancer. And then most importantly, you have to actually make a drug that can target that gene. And of course, to actually make a drug is its whole very complicated and expensive story, which I won't get into. But if you could do these steps, in theory, you could repeat the success of Gleevec. So what do these mutations actually do? So a guy named Robert Weinstein in the year 2000, and note how recently this is. This is only 21 years ago. He laid out 6 core functions that he said that the cancer has to be able to perform. And the major one is that it has to actually be able to grow on its own. That's what makes cancer cancer, right? It's tissue that grows out of control. And it also has to ignore the body's frantic signals to tell it to stop growing. It has to be able to invade and metastasize. It has to be immortal. It has to be able to divide an infinite number of times, which normal cells cannot. It has to be able to recruit blood cells to support the tumors that it creates. Otherwise, they'll just die from lack of nutrients. And it has to avoid the sort of emergency suicide mechanisms that our cells have built into them specifically to stop cancer. So let's talk about this top one, how cancer actually grows out of control. What are the changes? What actually happens in a cell to make this happen? And so an important concept for this is the cell information processing. So you could think of your cell actually as a computer. Okay, so they're actually not at all like computers. They don't work on the same principle at all. But they do devote an enormous or surprising amount of resources just to processing information so they can respond appropriately to things. And the way they process information is that they actually turn proteins on and off. So proteins are these little, essentially, you've heard of protein as a nutrient, but there are actually many, many proteins. There are 20,000 that human cells make, and they're all little molecular machines that have different functions, and some of them can be turned on and off by attaching a little molecule, a little molecular group called a phosphate group. So you might have a protein that's off without a phosphate group, and then you attach a phosphate group to it and you turn it on. And maybe when you turn on this protein, its job in turn is to attach a phosphate group to another protein and turn that on. And so you have these switches that can turn on other switches. And that, in fact, is exactly the basis of a computer. That's what a transistor is in a microchip. It's a switch that turns on or off other switches. And so cells can use this to process information. They don't do it like a computer. There's this competition, between proteins that are trying to turn other proteins on and others that are trying to turn them off. And sort of how that competition plays out drives what the cell does. And sort of the most important decision a cell can make that it uses this information processing capacity for is whether or not it's time to make a new cell, whether it's time to divide. So in the most common type of cancer called carcinomas, this whole process, this whole signaling pathway has been well mapped out. So carcinomas are the most common type of cancer. They arise from what are called epithelial cells, which are the cells that make up the linings of the body. So they make up the skin, the lungs, the intestines, the stomach, the uterus, the cervix, et cetera. And so I'm naming a bunch of tissues that give rise to cancer, right? And indeed, epithelial cells, by the way, there's varieties of epithelial cells. They're sort of named for their shape. But anyway, all these cells are sort of the big line of defense for the body. And that means that they're exposed to a lot of stress. They take the brunt of various infections and pathogens, and they also take the brunt of environmental toxins and other exposures. So think about the cells of the lung being exposed to cigarette smoke. Think about skin being exposed to UV light. And so in addition to facing those stresses, they also have to, repair themselves often because they face those stresses. So they're already kind of primed to divide because that's, you need to produce more of them to repair a wound in the body. Your skin has to close over if it's wounded, and so forth. And so that means that they're kind of primed to perform cancer. In a normal epithelial cell, it won't grow unless the body tells it to. And it might signal it to with a hormone such as EGF, which stands for epithelial growth factor, because it makes epithelial cells grow, conveniently how it's named. And it arrives at the surface here of this epithelial cell that's shown in this diagram. And on that surface, there's a epithelial growth factor receptor protein. And that starts when it receives epithelial growth factor, that triggers it to turn on other proteins that you can see in this long chain. These are all signaling proteins and they're all switches. So they're all switching each other on one after the other until you finally get a signal into the cell nucleus. And that signal tells the cell to divide. It's time to make more cells. So this is how the process works normally. But what if you mutate one of these switches? What if you stick it in the on position? Well, then you have a problem, right? Because now it doesn't matter what the body is telling the cell to do. If, say, a RAF protein here is switched on all the time, and this is sort of one of the canonical ways you get melanoma, is you get a mutation in a protein called BRAF that switches it on. Then you get this constant signal forever going into the cell nucleus that says divide, 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 make more. And so that's what the cell does. So if this process has all been mapped out, of course, you can imagine that drug companies have been pursuing developing targeted drugs like Gleevec that target each of these proteins. And in fact, I'm not an oncologist and I don't work with drugs, but these are just some of the ones that are kind of very familiar. And many of them are clinically approved, targeting all of these different proteins. There's actually many more proteins involved than are shown in sort of this cartoon diagram, but there has been no shortage of drugs targeting these proteins. And so you might imagine, well, we should have cured carcinomas by now, right? And we definitely have not. So why not? And there are three basic problems. The first problem is that actually we just don't have enough drugs still, despite what I showed you. It's not enough. Cancer is highly what's called heterogeneous, meaning there's a lot of diversity in the mutations that cause cancer. There are many different proteins that can be mutated in a given cancer and that can be mutated in different ways that don't all create the same vulnerabilities. So many patients, you just won't be offered a targeted therapy because your cancer might just not have an indicator. And even if you are, surprisingly, for reasons we still don't understand, many patients still don't show a response. So there's something scientifically we're missing. Most patients that have a good indicator for most therapies will show a response, but still a surprising number just don't, and we don't know why. And then the big one is the resistance problem. So I suspect you all may have heard of antibiotic resistant bacteria. And the same is a huge problem for cancer. So here's kind of how that works. So let's say a patient shows up at the clinic, and they're diagnosed with cancer. So we start with that 1 trillion cells I talked about, 1 trillion cancer cells. But there's good news. They do the biopsy and they sequence the DNA of the cancer, and they find that there's a mutation, which I've indicated with this little green squiggle. Call that mutation A. And there's a drug that targets mutation A cancers. That's pretty effective. And so we treat with that drug. But unfortunately, as I said, cancer, heterogeneous disease. That doesn't mean just that two patients are different from each other. That means that two different cancer cells in the same patient can be different from each other. And in fact, lurking in amongst these trillion cancer cells, there are a few that have a second mutation that's really important because it makes them resistant to drug A. And those survive the treatment with drug A. And so now the patient's in remission. Maybe this therapy has been phenomenally effective and actually there's no visible cancer left. But they're still called in remission because we don't know what might be lurking that we can't see. And in fact, in this case, unfortunately, there are a couple cells with this mutation that makes them resistant to drug A that survive. So we watch and we wait, and the cancer starts growing again. And now the patient relapses. They present or they come back to the clinic for a follow-up, and they have a return of their cancer. And now all these cancer cells have inherited this mutation B, and they're all resistant to drug A. Drug A no longer works. So now maybe you're lucky and you have a drug B that works on mutation B. And so you apply that drug. But in the process of this outgrowth, more cells have mutated and they developed another mutation we'll call mutation C that makes them resistant to drug B. And so you can imagine you can only go around this cycle so many times before you run out of drugs that work altogether. We don't have enough drugs, even for many patients have zero drugs that work this way. And certainly very few patients are going to have more than 2 or 3 that will actually be effective. And so that's why ultimately targeted therapy, single agent targeted therapy, it's now commonly accepted, almost never cures patients. So what else can we do, right? We're not going to stop there. Well, let's return to these 6 functions of cancer. There's actually a big one that's missing, and it's become kind of a very big buzzword in the world of cancer treatment. So what's missing from here that's very important for cancers is that they have to avoid the immune system. Turns out the immune system is very important for defeating cancer. And sort of the first example of this, which wasn't recognized for what it was at the time, but way back at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a patient who had an inoperable tumor on his face and neck. Or it wasn't inoperable, but they couldn't get it all out. And it was widely regarded. If you can't extract an entire tumor at that time with surgery, there was no hope for the patient. So it was just assumed that this would ultimately be fatal. But after the operation, he got a sort of accidental bacterial infection. And after the bacterial infection, his tumors just disappeared and never returned. And it was just this bizarre event that led people to think, well, there must be some kind of poison in this bacteria that this bacteria is producing that's really effective against cancer. And they tried to extract this poison and use it to treat cancer. Didn't work, because what actually happened was the immune system had been activated and had recognized the cancer as foreign and had destroyed it. So there's lots of evidence now that's accumulated that the immune system is very important. One of the biggest pieces is that people who are immunosuppressed, maybe they have AIDS or have received an organ transplant and are on immunosuppressive drugs, they have a much higher cancer risk than people who have a healthy immune system. And so that tells us that many cancers, the majority of cancers, are actually being destroyed by the immune system before they're ever found by clinicians. And so maybe you could harness the immune system. Some people were working on immunotherapy. Maybe we could actually treat advanced cancers by sort of re-engaging the immune system somehow and getting it to destroy them. And this was, again, not as bad as the chemotherapy backlash, but again, seen as kind of fuzzy, wishful thinking. And so these poor people kind of labored in the wilderness. There's a great documentary called Breakthrough about sort of one scientist who won the Nobel Prize not long ago in medicine for introducing immunotherapy and sort of what he went through to actually get this into the clinic. So how does it actually work? I am not an oncologist and I'm definitely not an immunologist. And the mammalian immune system is one of the most complicated sort of cellular stories in the human body. So I'm not going to in any way attempt to do justice to the whole immune system, and we don't have time even if I wanted to. But a very important component of the immune system for cancer and for viral infections is T cells. T cells come in different flavors, and their job is to recognize that something is off, something is foreign, and then to destroy it. And in particular, there's a variety of T cell that's responsible for ordering our cells to self-destruct, forcibly forces them to undergo what's called apoptosis, the self-destruct protocol, if it thinks there's something wrong with them. And so it's very important that it not do that to healthy human cells, right? Otherwise, your immune system would kill you in very short order. So there's a lot of sort of breaks and mechanisms to prevent that from happening. And one of the important ones is that there's this little flag. There's a couple little flags, but there's one very important one that cells are given that sort of is like a passcode that they present to T cells to prevent them from being destroyed by the T cell. And that protein is called PD-1. Ordinarily, a cell also sort of a normal cell looks healthy. The T cells have been selected, so they won't attack normal cells anyway. And the PD-1 is like an extra sort of layer of safety on top of that. But if you are a highly mutated cancer, you are quite ugly, and you look ugly to the immune system, and it will want to kill you. And so, how do these cancers escape the immune system surveillance? And the answer sometimes is that they really crank up the dial on PD-1, and they just protect themselves by displaying a ton of flags of PD-1. And then, that successfully defeats immune surveillance. So what if you interfered with this? And this approach is called immune checkpoint blockade therapy. You introduce a molecule that interferes with this recognition of this PD-1 passcode, and that leads the immune system to recognize the cancer and eliminate it. And in fact, in 2001, the FDA approved the first drugs following exactly this approach. And so here's a comparison of how that looks compared to like the targeted therapy approach I described earlier, like Gleevec approach versus the immunotherapy approach in terms of survival. So again, these are survival curves. And you might have standard therapy where, most patients die of their disease at a predictable sort of rate. With targeted therapy, you often achieve an early remission, or at least a slowing of the cancer progression. But ultimately, the cancer becomes resistant in that cycle I described. And so ultimately, you can't change the outcome for most patients. With immunotherapy, for reasons it's still unclear, many patients never respond at all. But the patients that do, it's very dramatic, and actually you achieve a cure. So this is finally like a really good approach to the trillion cell problem, right? That's what the immune system does really well, is hunt down every last aberrant cell and kill it. That's what it's evolved to do. So you can achieve real cures with immunotherapy, even with just one agent. Sometimes, not invariably, sometimes actually cancers become resistant even to that. And oftentimes, as I said, many patients don't respond in the first place. But when it works, it really works. Now, there is this caveat that it has, a cell has to be mutated a lot to actually look different to the immune system from a healthy cell. And not all cancers fall in this bucket. So what can you do when you have a cancer that's sort of at the opposite limit, where it hasn't mutated very much yet? It has what's called a quiet genome. Well, there is an alternate approach that you can take. And this is the last sort of treatment I'll talk about. It's the most sort of way out there. It's kind of almost, it seems like science fiction, but it's actually been done and it has worked. That is that you can actually re-engineer the immune cell to attack the immune system to attack cancer cells. And this is called CAR T cell therapy. And what this involves is you actually remove blood from a patient, you filter out a bunch of T cells from that blood, you infect the T cells with a virus that re-engineers their DNA. And this creates what's called a chimeric antigen receptor. So CAR, hence the CAR T cell is what you're making. Chimeric means that you're taking DNA from multiple sources and combining it. Antigen, is anything that stimulates the immune system. In this case, what you're doing is you're picking a protein that's on the surface of the cancer and you're engineering the T cell to attack cells that express that protein. And it's very important that you be able to survive without cells that have that protein on the surface. That's a major limitation to this approach, because once the immune system gets going on those cells, it's not going to stop until it wipes out all the cells that show that protein. So you got to be sure the patient can survive without it. And so this won't work for many cancers. But there is in B-cell lymphoma, it does work. There is such a protein that B-cell lymphoma has to have on its surface that normal B cells do not have to have. And so this has been done successfully for B-cell lymphoma. So it's very dangerous. The way this works, after you've made the T cells, you kill off most of the patient's immune system with regular immunotherapy. And so the idea is that you're creating this vacuum, and then when you reintroduce these genetically engineered T cells back in the patient's body, they'll sort of explosively proliferate to fill that vacuum. So it's like you're taking the whole immune system and it's like a slingshot. You're pulling it back as far as you can and then letting it go. And you can imagine this is, a very harrowing experience for patients. Patients do die, and the resulting sort of the immune system becomes extremely angry when you do this, and it kills patients sometimes. But usually not. And hopefully this will continue to get safer as clinicians get more experience with this and we learn more about how to manage it. And the amazing thing is that it cures 60% of patients who undergo it. Now, a patient with B-cell lymphoma, to undergo this therapy, something this dramatic and this dangerous, they have to have failed absolutely everything else. And oncologists know once a cancer has become resistant to everything else, virtually nothing works very well. So to cure 60% of those patients with this approach is absolutely extraordinary. And it's still early. Like, we still don't know how much better we can do than that. So many limitations, highly dangerous, but really extraordinarily effective, and sort of scientifically very compelling, right? This is sort of an amazing thing to do. It still seems to me like something out of a science fiction movie. Immunotherapy overall, not terribly safe. So it may sound sort of warm and fuzzy, this idea that you're harnessing the body's own immune system, but the body's immune system is terrifying. It is, the 800-pound gorilla of the microscopic world. It's an engine for killing cells. That's what it was designed to do, and to do it very well. And it has these safety brakes on it for a reason. And so many people will tolerate immunotherapy very well, and have no side effects. And they may be completely cured and have had virtually no side effects. But I don't want anyone to get the impression that that's necessarily the case, that immunotherapy has no downsides and no risks. So here is a chart showing sort of the fraction of adverse reactions that people have to immunotherapy, various combinations of immunotherapy, checkpoint blockade drugs. Not uncommon. Not uncommon at all. And there are really unfortunate cases where patients have actually been cured by immunotherapy. On autopsy, it's found that their cancers are completely gone, but that autopsy is performed because their immune system killed them. Once it's engaged, it can be very hard to turn off. So that I just wanted to mention that caveat, because there are a lot of clinical trials right now involving immunotherapy, and they may be worth enrolling in if there's reason to think it will work for you. But they're not necessarily well designed. So this is something to bear in mind. So let's put this all together quickly and sort of just to summarize where we are now. So there are the classic mainstays of cancer that haven't really changed since the 80s. Surgery and radiation haven't changed since, well, surgery has gone more advanced. I guess I shouldn't say that, but these have been around for quite a while. The workhorses that most patients are still offered, and they are very effective at non-metastatic solid tumors if a surgeon can get all the tumor out, right? So usually you'll do surgery, and then after that, you'll do radiation or chemotherapy or both to try and kill any cancer cells that the surgeon missed that you can't see, just to give you additional coverage. And hopefully that gets you from 1 trillion cells to 0. And often it does, and the patient can be cured this way. And chemotherapy alone can also cure leukemias and lymphomas in many cases. But solid metastatic tumors, so what we classically think of as cancer, your breast cancer, your colon cancer, and so on, usually won't be cured by this approach, although there are exceptions. Precision drugs I went over, Gleevec is the canonical example and is basically curative, but usually they aren't. They are, the great majority of them are much less toxic than traditional chemotherapies. It's a much more pleasant therapy to undergo. But there are still relatively few approved targets. You know, that's changing, but slowly and very expensively. Each of these drugs cost an just obscene amount to develop. And one drug at a time is not enough. The cancer will develop resistance most of the time in return. Immune checkpoint blockade is most effective when a cancer has many mutations. Many patients won't respond, but those that do respond are often actually cured. The immune system, you know, has that capacity to actually eliminate all cells of a given class. And then finally, we have this most recent version, which is CAR T-cell therapy, which has only been used successfully, I think, in B-cell lymphoma, actually, although they're looking at it for other types of disease. A very dangerous therapy still at present, hopefully will become safer, but also a very high cure rate. So where do we hope to go from here? Because obviously all this still is not enough. Still a third of patients will die of their cancer. And if you subset to metastatic cancer, you know, it's a much higher fraction of patients that will die. So Eric Lander, he's near and dear to our hearts because he was the founding director of the Broad Institute. He's since left to be the national science advisor to President Biden for a while. He liked this metaphor of the chess game. You know, we make a move by applying a drug, cancer evolves some kind of resistance and makes another move. And we respond with a different drug. And eventually we're going to have mapped out, you know, what it is that the cancer can do, and we can anticipate its moves and treat in advance and sort of escape the cycle of treatment resistance, which is you know, sort of the dream that we hope to achieve. And so the reason it's a good chess analogy is the idea is you put the cancer in checkmate by blocking all of the possible moves it could make. You just need enough pieces on the board. Unfortunately, if cancer is a chess game, you know, we're not anywhere close to that. We're missing most of the pieces, i.e. drugs that we need. And we still don't know how half of the pieces that are on the board actually move. So there's definitely work to be done. And yet I am optimistic. So why be optimistic? Why do people in this field feel like this is not actually a hopeless problem and progress is being made? Well, empirically, progress has been made. I showed that at the beginning of this talk. Patient outcomes are meaningfully different now, and in some diseases, basically totally different from what they used to be. And we think we're going to expand on that. The useful way to think about this is that, you know, periodically there's this idea of a moonshot for cancer. We decided we were going to go to the moon. You know, President Kennedy made a speech and announced we were going to the moon, and 10 years later we went to the moon. Why can't we do that for cancer? And actually Nixon did kind of do more or less the announcement that we were going to cure cancer, and we were just going to decide to do it and throw money at the problem and we would do it. Well, the difference is that the moon program, when it was launched, was based on very settled science, right? The Newtonian laws of physics have been settled for centuries by that point. And so it really was just an engineering problem where you put money and bright people towards it, and, you know, out comes the solution. When the war on cancer was first announced in the 70s, it was totally unsolved. We didn't even have the regular human genome sequenced. There was still a live disagreement about the basic process that would make a cell cancerous. That wasn't understood, let alone the specific mutations that made cells cancerous. And all that has been kind of mapped out since. So that level of the science at least has been settled. And so we're gradually sort of in this transition from it being a scientific problem to being an engineering problem. It remains, there are many unsolved scientific problems. I've alluded to some in this talk. It's why I have a job and why many people will be employed as scientists in this field for a long time. But it is sort of in this transitional phase where it becomes more an engineering problem. Can we engineer the drugs to take advantage of the things we've learned about cancer? And so that's why I'm optimistic that, the cure for cancers, the cures for cancer, I should say, because of course it will be many different drugs and it will be for many different patients, will happen in the same way F. Scott Fitzgerald said about bankruptcy, gradually, and then maybe all at once. And we are sort of starting to see how that could happen. So some final thoughts. One of the major limiting factors is that we need more drugs. Once a drug is developed, it's known. Once the expense has been put in, that drug remains in play more or less indefinitely. It always exists. But the money upfront to produce a drug that is safe and can be used is intense. And we will also, as we get more drugs in play, we're going to need a paradigm shift in oncology that's less reactive, that we're not sitting and waiting for a cancer to return. We're not just applying the same drug or same treatment regimen until it stops working and then trying to switch to something else, because at that point, the cancer may already have developed the cells that will be resistant to the next thing we try, and it may stay one step ahead of us. So a more proactive regime where actually, even while regimen A is still working for the patient, you may need to introduce regimen B to kill off the rest of the cells that are resistant to regimen A. And then I want to say, for everyone who will face cancer and will, at some point you may fail existing therapies. I hope not for anyone here, but you may be looking at clinical trials, for new options for yourself. And a very important point is that just because something is a clinical trial doesn't mean that there's actually a good basis for thinking it will work. This was kind of surprising to me, but pharmaceutical companies launch clinical trials based on combinations of approved drugs. They're basically just kind of a combination hunch and wishful thinking that maybe there will be benefit. The current big one for this is immunotherapy plus chemotherapy. There are tons of clinical trials for combinations of different immunotherapy agents, different chemotherapy agents, and they're often not well founded. So questions to ask would be sort of, what's the scientific hypothesis? What is it about my cancer that would lead me to think that this would work for me? And then the final thing, medicine will often fail. A third of patients will die, which means that many cancer patients are failed ultimately by science. Maybe it buys them life, but it doesn't buy them a cure. And so there's obviously a strong urge to turn to alternative methods. And I would never judge someone who faces sort of the end of the road with approved treatments and decides to do this. But I do want to say to always bear in mind, again, cancer cells are human cells. Any treatment that can kill a cancer cell can kill a human cell. So always bear in mind that just because something has the label of natural or alternative, if it is actually effective at killing cancer cells, that means it must be effective at killing human cells as well. And the only way to know if there's a therapeutic window is through real testing. So that's all I have today. We do have some time for any questions that might have come up during the talk.
Any questions? No? You can throw them in the chat or you can unmute and talk.
Hello. I have a question.
Sure.
All of this is about what to do once you get the cancer. Is there any research or thought about prevention?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of research into cancer prevention. So it's estimated that about 50% of cancers are due to some kind of environmental factor that could be controlled. Now that means that 50% of cancers are not. They're just intrinsic. You get the wrong gamma ray from the sun at the wrong time, or the wrong UV ray or something, and that's what triggers it. So it's important to remember that there's a limit. No amount of healthy living can ultimately eliminate your cancer risk, but there's a huge amount of research into what causes cancer and therefore how to prevent it. There was hope for a while, for example, that there might be these superfoods that, the antioxidants might be the solution to cancer. Cancer was caused by oxidation. Unfortunately, it turned out that in clinical trials, occasionally, the high doses of these antioxidants actually fueled the cancer. Cancer needs vitamins too. It's a human cell, and so it actually does great when it's supplied the right vitamins. So the kinds of nutritional approaches basically have been really disappointing. I would say over the last decade, basically, people have come to the conclusion that there's not any miraculous food you can eat that will prevent your cancer risk, and that we have to look elsewhere to understand what it is that helps prevent cancer. So for right now, most of the prescriptions are sort of the obvious ones, not very exciting, sort of mostly negative: avoid tobacco, avoid alcohol, at least in excess, exercise, healthy weight, all these things that, just sort of make you healthy also help prevent cancer.
We have a question in the chat, Josh. You mentioned that most metastatic cancers can't be cured by traditional methods. Are most metastatic cancers not cured?
Yes, that is the case. Most metastatic cancers are ultimately lethal for the patient.
I have a question about a study a while back by Eric, Dr. Topol, over, I guess he's over in the Scripps Institute in California. He was doing a longevity study. Basically, he says that people who live for a very long time have a unique repair mechanism on your genetics, on your code, such that when you get a incorrect code, your body could go in and repair this problem. Have you ever heard of this kind of study, and are there any advances in that area?
So I'm not familiar with the specific study you're talking about. It is definitely true that cells have what are called DNA repair mechanisms. It's very important. It's not surprising that it would turn out that one of the things that helps you live for a long time is having better than normal DNA repair mechanisms in your cells. There's certainly a lot of research on this. There's Calico, which stands for California Life Company, is a spinoff from Google that actually focuses specifically on aging research and is devoted to questions just like this. And certainly cancer is a disease of aging. The reason it used to be a very rare disease, the reason it's so common now is that we live long enough to get it. And it's a disease of the genome, so DNA repair is very important. I don't think so. If you imagine combining this with the question about prevention, yeah, there's a hypothetical future where we figure out how to sort of supercharge DNA repair and sort of prevent cancer in this way. But it's a very long way, I think, from any sort of proof of concept.
Apparently, the idea is that we have cancer in us all the time. We have cancers, we're getting cancers all the time, but we're able to handle the genetic difficulties as we go. So it's not that we're cancer free. We all have cancer here. It's just that we're not expressing it.
Yeah. So there are a variety of sort of mechanisms and backstops that the body has, for sure. Once a cell starts sort of down the road to malignancy, there's a lot of things the body does. And unfortunately, I just wasn't able to cover, there are many really important stories to tell about this. One very important protein, the most famous protein in the body, sort of the rock star of cellular science, is called P53, and it exists to stop, it's basically a suicide mechanism for cells. It exists to stop cancer, and people who are born with defective copies of P53, unfortunately, usually develop their first cancers by adolescence. So yes, yeah, your body is always engaged in actively preventing cancer, and those methods are very important. For sure.
Thank you.
Good questions.
All right, I guess if there are no more questions, thank you for coming, everybody. And this was recorded, so we will be able to post it publicly soon if you would like to rewatch it or tell other people about it. Have a nice Friday.
Thanks, everyone.